conference call. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna, Bhagavati Vasudha Mataji. Please accept my humble obeisances. This is Kaumudiki Dasi from Baltimore. All
Hare Krishna. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Thank you. Thank you so much, Mataji, for giving your valuable association in this call regularly. Hare Krishna.
Thank you, Mataji. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna, Mataji. Dandavat pranam. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Guru Maharaj ki jai. This is Arvindas Das from Chicago. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna, Arvindas Prabhuji. Dandavat pranam. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Thank you, Prabhuji, for joining Bhakti Sangha conference call. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna, Bhagavati Vasudha Mataji, Dandavat Pranam, all glories to Srila Prabhupada. This is Vinita Gandharvika Devidasi from Texas. Hare Krishna.
Vinita Gandharvika Mataji, Dandavat Pranam, Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Thank you, Mataji, for joining Sangha conference call. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna, Bhagavati Vasudha Mataji. Please accept my humble obeisances. All glories to Srila Prabhupada and Shri Guru and Shri Gauranga, and to all the assembled devotees. This is Megha from Naperville. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna, Megha Mataji, Dandavat Pranam, Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Thank you, Mataji, for joining Bhakti Sangha conference call. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna, Bhagavati Vasudha Mataji, all glories to Srila Prabhupada and Guru Maharajis. My humble obeisances to you and all the devotees. This is Krishna Kumari Devidasi from Bangla.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Kumari Mataji, Dandavat Pranam, Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Thank you, Mataji, for joining Bhakti Sangha conference call. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna, Bhagavati Vasudha Mataji, Dandavat Pranam. All glories to Srila Prabhupada, all glories to Guru Maharajas, and all glories to the assembled devotees. This is Tiffany in Pennsylvania. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna, Tiffany Mataji, Dandavat Pranam, Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Thank you so much, Mataji, for joining Bhakti Sangha conference call. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna, Mataji, Dandavat Pranam. Please accept my humble obeisances. All glories to Srila Prabhupada and Shri Guru and Gauranga, and all assembled devotees. Yashomati from Chicago.
Hare Krishna, Yashomati Mataji, Dandavat Pranam, Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Thank you so much, Mataji, for joining Bhakti Sangha conference call. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna, Bhagavati Vasudha Mataji, Dandavat Pranam to you and all Vaishnava. Srila Prabhupada, Srila Gurudev ki jai. Vrinda.
Hare Krishna, Vrinda Gopika Mataji, Dandavat Pranam, Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Thank you, Mataji, for joining Bhakti Sangha conference call. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna, Bhagavati Vasudha Mataji, Dandavat Pranam, Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Guru Maharaj ki jai. This is Shama Gauri Devidasi from Charlotte.
Hare Krishna, Shama Gauri Mataji, Dandavat Pranam, Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Thank you so much, Mataji, for joining Bhakti Sangha conference call. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna, Bhagavati Vasudha Mataji. Please accept my humble obeisances. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. All glories to the assembled devotees. This is Anita from Sharjah. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna, Anita Mataji, Dandavat Pranam, Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Thank you, Mataji, for joining Bhakti Sangha conference call. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna, Bhagavati Vasudha Mataji. Please accept my humble obeisances into your lotus feet. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. All glories to assembled devotees. All glories to Guru and Gauranga. This is Pooja Arora from Haridwar.
Hare Krishna, Pooja Arora Mataji, Dandavat Pranam, Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Thank you, Mataji, for joining Bhakti Sangha conference call. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna, Mataji. All glories to Srila Prabhupada, Gurudev, and all the assembled devotees. This is Haridada from Washington, Fairfax, Virginia. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna, Mataji, Dandavat Pranam, Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Thank you so much, Mataji, for joining Bhakti Sangha conference call. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna, Mataji, Dandavat Pranam. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. All glories to all Guru Maharajas. All glories to the assembled devotees. This is Shiromani Nandarani Devidasi from Qatar. Hare Krishna, Mataji.
Hare Krishna, Shiromani Nandarani Mataji, Dandavat Pranam, Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Thank you, Mataji, for joining Bhakti Sangha conference call. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna, Bhagavati Vasudha Mataji. Please accept my humble obeisances. All glories to Srila Prabhupada and all the assembled devotees. This is Indulika Karuna Devidasi from Lincoln.
Hare Krishna, Indulika Karuna Mataji, Dandavat Pranam, Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Thank you, Mataji, for joining Bhakti Sangha conference call. Hare Krishna. Yeah, welcome all of you. Thank you everyone for joining today's Bhakti Sangha conference call. Today, we are really fortunate to have His Grace Chaitanya Lila Prabhu ji to enlighten us on the topic of Srimad Bhagavatam 6.1.38 onwards. So, before I hand over the call to Prabhuji, I would like to hand over the call to Tiffany Mataji to give a brief introduction. Hare Krishna. Hare Krishna, Prabhuji. Thank you so much for giving. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna. Hare Krishna Mataji. Hare Krishna Prabhuji. We are so fortunate to have with us this morning His Grace Chaitanya Lila Prabhuji. He is a disciple of His Holiness Radhanath Swami. After completing engineering studies from the University of Delhi, IIT Kharagpur, Chaitanya Lila Prabhuji gathered a few years of corporate work experience with an IT MNC in Mumbai. Thereafter, he decided to serve the society at large as a resident monk at Sri Sri Radha Gopinath Mandir, Iskan Chowpatty in Mumbai. For the last 12 years, he has been actively involved in sharing the essence of Vedic scriptures with others at a number of corporate, social, and educational enterprises. At the temple, Prabhuji also heads the temple IT department and assists in youth outreach. Hare Krishna. Welcome to the call, Prabhuji.
So, thank you very much, Shyama Gauri Mataji and Bhagavati Vasudha Mataji, for having me over here. It's a great fortune to be amidst all of you and to share some of my thoughts on today's verse. So today we'll be reading from Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 6, Chapter 1, verse number 38. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Shri Vishnu Duta Uchuhu Yuyam Vai Dharma Rajasya Yadi Nirdeshakarinah Bruta Dharmasya Nastatvam Yacha Dharmasya Lakshanam. The word-to-word translation. Shri Vishnu Duta Uchuhu. The blessed messengers of Lord Vishnu spoke. Yuyam, all of you. What, why, indeed. Dharmarajasya, of King Yamraj, who knows the religious principles. Yadi, if. Nirdeshakarinaha, order carriers. Bruta, just speak. Dharmasya, of religious principles. Naha, unto us. Tattvam, the truth. Yat, that which. Cha, also. Adharmasya, of impious activities. Lakshanam, symptoms. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Translation. The blessed messengers of Lord Vishnu, the Vishnu Dutas, said, if you're actually servants of Yamraj, you must explain to us the meaning of religious principles and the symptoms of irreligion. Purport. This inquiry by the Vishnu Dutas to the Yamdutas is most important. A servant must know the instructions of his master. The servants of Yamraj claimed to be carrying out his orders, and therefore the Vishnu Dutas very intelligently asked them to explain the symptoms of religion and interreligious principles. A Vaishnava knows these principles perfectly well because he is well acquainted with the instructions of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. The Supreme Lord says, Sarva dharman parityajya mam ekam sharanam vraja. Give up all other varieties of religion and just surrender unto me. Therefore, surrender unto the Supreme Personality of Godhead is the actual principle of religion. Those who have surrendered to the principles of material nature instead of to Krishna are all impious, regardless of their material position. Unaware of the principles of religion, they do not surrender to Krishna, and therefore they are considered sinful rascals, the lowest of men, and fools bereft of all knowledge. As Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, 7th chapter, 15th verse, Namam duskritino mudha prapadyante naradhamaha mayaya prithaggyana asuram bhavam ashrita. Those miscreants who are grossly foolish, lowest among mankind, whose knowledge is stolen by illusion, and who partake of the atheistic nature of demons, do not surrender unto me. One who has not surrendered to Krishna does not know the true principle of religion. Otherwise, he would have surrendered. The question posed by the Vishnu Dutas was very suitable. One who represents someone else must fully know that person's mission. The devotees in the Krishna consciousness movement must therefore be fully aware of the mission of Krishna and Lord Chaitanya. Otherwise, they will be considered foolish. All devotees, especially preachers, must know the philosophy of Krishna consciousness so as not to be embarrassed and insulted when they preach. Om Jnana-timirandhasya Jnananjana-shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Sthapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamahyam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guroho Shri Yuta Padakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunathanvitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadhutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakhan Vitamscha He Krishna Karuna Sindho Deenabandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vancha Kalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jaya Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Srivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. So we would like to welcome all the devotees who have gathered this morning for this Srimad Bhagavatam class here at the Bhakti Sangha conference. And it's my good fortune to be amidst all the devotees and just wanting to share something that I've studied on this subject matter. So in this particular section of the Srimad Bhagavatam, we have been seeing how this particular chapter starts with Parikshit Maharaj explaining about different actions, about the importance of one becoming serious before one meets one's death. And that is because one might have committed a lot of sinful activities, and it's important to find recourse, or it's important to atone for those sinful activities so that one is able to transport himself not back into the material existence. And as the discussion goes ahead, Sukdev Goswami mentions that no matter what kind of atonement one may perform, but every action in this world is prone to reaction, is prone to cause bondage. And therefore, Sukdev Goswami he explains that the perfect solution to actually escape from the bondage of action and reaction is engagement in devotional service. We also learn from the Bhagavad Gita how the Bhagavad Gita explains the principles of karma, vikarma, and akarma. Pious activities, sinful activities, and activities that actually free one from the bondage of karma. And Going ahead, the story of Ajamil is narrated by Srila Sukdev Goswami, and how Ajamil, even though unconsciously he was rendering devotional service by chanting the name of his son Narayan, even that unconscious performance of devotional service got credited for him, and he achieved the merits of receiving a second chance to perfect his life. And in this particular section, this particular verse, we are seeing that how Ajamil had to be taken by the Yamadutas. The Yamadutas have arrived, but then just because Ajamil had been calling out to his son Narayan, seeing the fierce form of the Yamadutas, hearing Ajamil call out to Narayan in a very helpless manner, the Vishnu Dutas also arrive, and the Vishnu Dutas, they stop the Yamadutas and they question the Yamadutas for their activities. And this is a very surprising, a very unique kind of a conversation that is happening between the Vishnu Dutas and the Yamadutas, because the Yamadutas are actually on a emergency mission. The Ajamil is supposed to leave his body, and the Yamadutas have come to take away Ajamil, take away the soul from the body, and take them to Yamloka for further punishment and so on. And so therefore this is kind of a very emergency situation. Someone's death, someone is actually leaving the body, is a very intense situation, is a very emergency situation. And here we find that in such an emergency situation, here there is a dialogue that is going on, a meeting that is going on between the Vishnu Dutas and the Yamadutas, which is very rare. Usually in an emergency situation there is only action, but then we find that this beautiful discussion happening between the Vishnu Dutas and the Yamadutas, and out of which there is a lot for us to learn. There's a lot for us to actually imbibe in our own lives. And that's the reason why this episode of Ajamil finds a mention in the Srimad Bhagavatam. Srila Prabhupada, in the last paragraph of this particular purport, he writes something very interesting. He writes that the question posed by the Vishnu Dutas was very suitable. One who represents someone else must fully know that person's mission. The devotees in the Krishna consciousness movement, actually the Vishnu Dutas, they ask the Yamadutas about clarity, if they are aware of the religious and irreligious principles. And Srila Prabhupada takes that point and he mentions that the devotees in the Krishna consciousness movement must therefore be fully aware of the mission of Krishna and Lord Chaitanya. Otherwise, they'll be considered foolish. All devotees, especially the preachers, must know the philosophy of Krishna consciousness so as not to be embarrassed and insulted when they preach. In other words, this is kind of a instruction for all of us sadhakas, all of us, the members of the Krishna consciousness movement. Srila Prabhupada is trying to instruct us, through these sentences, and he wants to help us understand our responsibilities as the members of the Hare Krishna movement, that how, as the members of the Hare Krishna movement, we are not just recipients of Krishna and Lord Chaitanya's mercy. We are not just, we may call it as consumers of that mercy, but we are also representative or salesmen, saleswomen of the mercy of Lord Chaitanya, of the product of the pure devotional service. And therefore, external representation as a devotee of the Hare Krishna movement also brings into our life internal responsibility to represent the movement in a very sublime manner. And therefore the question here is not why should we be representing Srila Prabhupada's movement, Lord Chaitanya's movement in a nice manner. It's not a question, because all of us are before the entire world as devotees, as members of the Hare Krishna movement. And therefore a better question would be, how do we do it? How do we become good order carriers of Lord Chaitanya? How can we also represent the parampara in a very nice manner, parampara very properly? And what is it that will help us become good representatives of the Supreme Lord. And ultimately, what is it that will fetch us, and what is it that will fetch others through us? More mercy of the Supreme Lord. So we'll try to look at a few of these aspects as to what is it that will actually help us become more better representatives of Srila Prabhupada, better representatives of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and of the Hare Krishna movement. And therefore, it is said that, just like here, we find that the Vishnu Dutas, they are questioning the knowledge of the Yamdutas, that are Yamdutas aware of the basis on which they are acting? The Yamdutas have come to snatch away the soul from the body of Ajamil, and the Vishnu Dutas asking them that what are the principles, what are those principles, the religious principles based on which you're carrying out your actions. And something similar also applies in our own lives. When we are into the practice of the Krishna consciousness process, the process of Krishna consciousness, when we are also engaged in this beautiful process of devotional service, it behooves us to actually know as to why are we doing whatever we are doing. And therefore, there are two things that we'll be highlighting today. We'll try to discuss a bit in detail as to how these two aspects of proper knowledge and proper behavior, proper conduct, having proper knowledge of why we are carrying out whatever we are doing in as devotees, as sadhakas, in this process of bhakti, and then how do we carry ourselves in the outside world, how do we behave, how do we conduct ourselves. So these two aspects will actually help us become better representatives of the mission of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. So it is mentioned that just like a tree is strong not by the power of its trunk or the power of its branches, but the strength of a tree is known by the strength of its roots, how deep the roots of the tree are, and how nicely connected that tree is inside. In other words, it is the foundation of the tree, it is the deep foundation, the deep roots of the tree, which defines the stability of the tree. If a tree has very strong and deep roots, even in very, very adverse situations, even in cyclones or tornadoes, these trees stand strong. They're not swayed away so easily. But then if the tree itself is very, very high externally, but internally, if the root is very shallow or not very strong, even with a small gust of wind, even with in very, very not so strong cyclones or not so strong winds, the trees easily are uprooted. And similarly, knowledge is considered as that kind of a root. The understanding of the philosophy, the understanding of philosophical basis of Krishna consciousness are like those strong roots. The stronger those roots are, the better will it be possible, the more will it be possible for us to actually stand strong when we go through difficult times in life, when we go through those tough times in life, and when practice of bhakti seems to be difficult, seems to that maybe I'll need to kind of reduce my standard of practice, but if the philosophical knowledge is very, very strong, we'll be able to stand strong in all adversities, and we'll be able to carry out our practice no matter what may come. And therefore, it is very important for us to first of all focus. Here these instructions of Srila Prabhupada actually give us that impetus to dive deep into the philosophical understanding of Krishna consciousness and get a reason, get a basis, get a purpose, understand the purpose in a better manner as to why at all are we practicing Krishna consciousness. The stronger that understanding is, the stronger that purpose is, the more confident we'll be. So in the first canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, the symptoms of people in the age of Kali Yuga are mentioned. So the verse says, Prayena alpa yusha sabhya kalavasmin yuge janaha manda sumanda matyo manda bhagya upadratah. So people in the age of Kali, they are characterized by, most of the people, Bhagavatam says, most of the people will be having very, very short lifespan. Prayena alpa ayushah sabhya kalav asmin yuge janaha manda, they will be lazy. People in Kali Yuga will be lazy, especially for taking up spiritual practices. Sumanda matayo, their intelligence will not be very, very strong to understand spiritual subject matters. And manda bhagya, they will be unfortunate. And upadratah. So this particular verse of Srimad Bhagavatam, especially highlights that how people in the age of Kali Yuga, they have very, very short memories. Sumanda matayo, the intelligence is very feeble, or whatever we hear, we kind of forget. And therefore, when we come to Krishna consciousness, we do a lot of hearing. We learn the principles of Krishna consciousness. But over a period of time, because of the influence of Kali Yuga, sometimes we may tend to forget what we have learned. And this is very evident from the fact that, even in our everyday lives, we forget so many things. Sometimes we forget the names of the people we meet in life. We forget, passwords of, we forget where we have kept the keys of the car. And we also sometimes forget what other people have done for us, what others have done for us, including the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And this is a characteristic of the conditioned soul in the material world, where they are unaware, where they have completely forgotten what Krishna has done for them. And therefore, in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna speaks about his connection, with the living entities. Krishna speaks about his contribution as to how he is sustaining the life, how he is sustaining this entire creation, and how he is sustaining the material nature that is working under his direction. And in so many verses, Krishna is enlightening the conditioned soul about his connection with the living entity and his contribution for the welfare of the conditioned soul, for the welfare of the living beings in this material world. And therefore, there is this beautiful Sanskrit word, kritagya, or being grateful. Now, kritagya comes from two different words, kritagya. When someone remembers what has been done for them, krita means some activity or something that has been done, and gya means to be aware of. So when someone is aware of what someone else has done for them, then there is gratitude, then there is kritagyata. And only in proper awareness of that knowledge, only in proper awareness of what has been done for them, could there be proper reciprocation. And therefore, in order for us to actually practice bhakti, it is very, very important for us to be aware of what has been done by Krishna in our own lives. Or in other words, the entire gamut of the scriptures actually speak about the connection of Krishna and the contribution of Krishna to reclaim the souls in this material world and to take them back to his own abode, the spiritual abode. And therefore, it is very important. Prabhupada repeatedly in so many of his purports, in so many of his classes, in so many of his books, repeatedly he brings about this point of not being lazy when it comes to philosophical study, when it comes to cultivating the knowledge of pure devotional service, cultivating the philosophical understanding, the philosophical basis of Krishna consciousness. In the Chaitanya Charitamrita, Adi Lila, this is second chapter of the Adi Lila, 117th verse, which says, Siddhanta boliya chitte na karoho alas, iha hoite Krishna lage sudridh manas. A sincere student should not neglect the discussion of such conclusions, considering them controversial, for such discussions strengthen the mind. Siddhanta boliya chitte, when it comes to discussing the Siddhanta, when it comes to discussing or learning the philosophical basis of Krishna consciousness, na karo ho alas. Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami mentions that one should not be lazy at all. And he also explains that what is the benefit of being very enthusiastic, what is the benefit of learning this philosophy, in a very, very strong manner. He says, Iha hoite Krishna lage sudrida manas. Thus, one's mind becomes attached to Sri Krishna. And this is something, again, very, very important for us, because in our practical day-to-day experience, we find that how the conditioned mind, the polluted mind, the mind which is filled of material desires, repeatedly presents obstacles for us on the path of devotional service, repeatedly kind of discourages us, dissuades us from taking steps in the process of devotional service. And therefore there is a constant tussle that keeps happening between the desire of the living being, the desire of the sadhaka to please Krishna, and the desire of the mind to continue on with sense gratification, because that is how the mind has been conditioned in this material world. And for us to actually win this fight, if we are at all wanting that the devotional side of us actually wins the fight with the conditioned mind and transforms the conditioned mind into a spiritual entity, if at all we aspire to win this fight, it is very, very important that we develop the philosophical understanding. Because whenever the mind presents a argument that maybe this is not the time, maybe I shouldn't be doing so much, already I've been into a lot of practice, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, and so many reasons the mind presents. But then if the philosophical understanding is strong, we'll be able to give counter arguments to the mind, and in that fight the sadhaka is going to come out victorious. And therefore Prabhupada writes that one should be particularly careful to understand the truth of Krishna. So we'll try to discuss some of the benefits and some of the disadvantages of not having a strong philosophical basis to one's practice. If someone doesn't have a strong philosophical basis, what are the three disadvantages? What are the three effects of not having a proper philosophical understanding? So we'll discuss first the effects of not having a proper philosophical understanding, and thereafter we'll discuss three effects of having a proper philosophical understanding, a proper philosophical basis to one's practice. So if someone doesn't have a strong philosophical basis, if someone is not strong in the philosophical understanding of Krishna consciousness, the very first thing that happens is one remains in delusion. One continues to be in ignorance, because that is how the life in material world is. Now, Krishna bhuliya jiv bhogavancha kare, nikata sthita tare maya jhapatiya dhare. The Chaitanya Charitamrita mentions that in this material world, the living entity has forgotten Krishna. And having forgotten Krishna, the living entity is busy in the false aspiration of seeking joy through material sense gratification. And by doing so, that ignorance keeps continuing unless and until that ignorance is slashed by the sword of knowledge. Asanga shastrena dridhena chitva. One should read, Krishna mentions in the Bhagavad Gita that how one should give away, one should cut this bondage of ignorance with the sword of knowledge. So if one doesn't develop this knowledge, one doesn't cultivate this knowledge, one continues to remain in delusion. One continues to remain in ignorance that material sense gratification will fetch me happiness. Even after multiple experiences, even after multiple failures where one has experienced that material sense gratification is only momentary in nature and is very, very fickle, But then spiritual experience is something that is way beyond, is something that is uncomparable to material sense gratification. So if at all one has to overcome this delusion, the practice of knowledge of bhakti is very, very important. Srila Rupa Goswami in the Upadeshamrit, the third verse of the Upadeshamrit, Srila Rupa Goswami writes that, actually Srila Prabhupada writes in the translation of Upadeshamrit, he says, to make rapid advancement in the cult of devotional service, one should be very active and should persevere in executing the duties specified in the revealed scriptures and confirmed by the spiritual master. In other words, one should practice this process of bhakti as it is instructed in the Shastras and as it is explained by the previous acharyas and by the current spiritual master. If one is not repeatedly getting the instructions, if one is not repeatedly receiving the instructions of Guru, Sadhu and Shastra, if one is not cultivating that knowledge, very soon, one will be confused. And that is the second part, that how, if there is not a strong cultivation of knowledge, sometimes there is this confusion. Even though we practice devotional service, but we are misguided about the goal of devotional service. Whatever, and Srila Prabhupada writes that there are a lot of examples in this regard where people have got deviated. So this deviation is another disadvantage of not having a proper philosophical basis. And Srila Prabhupada gives the example of the Sahajiyas. He gives the examples of those practitioners who feel or who feel that they have now reached the summit, they have now reached the zenith of devotional service, and now they can behave like a Uttama Adhikari, even though they might be situated on the Kanishta platform. But then because of lack of philosophical knowledge, they consider themselves to be very, very advanced and start behaving as advanced devotees, start behaving as Uttam Adhikaris. And Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, he gives a very, very strong opinion on this subject matter. He writes that those who shed tears by practice, again, those who shed tears by practice, not by actual experience of devotion, but by practice, there are people who learn to shed tears. And these tears, they claim that these tears are spontaneous tears out of affection for the Supreme Lord. But actually, they have learned how to shed tears by practice. Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur is mentioning. But those whose hearts have not changed are known to be stone-hearted devotees of the lowest grade. Even though they may be categorized as devotees, they might be into the process of bhakti, but because the philosophy is not very strong, because that knowledge of bhakti is not very strong, such devotees are labeled by, are referred by the acharyas, by Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur here, as stone-hearted devotees of the lowest grade. And therefore, their imitation crying induced by artificial practice is always condemned. So this confusion, this deviation happens when there is a lack of philosophical knowledge, when one is not clear about the different levels of devotional service, when one is not clear about the steps that one needs to take in order to advance on the process of devotional service. But because of a poor fund of knowledge, even though they are at a very, very low stage of practice, but then they start claiming and they start behaving as if they are very, very exalted. So this deviation is another disadvantage, is another ill effect of not having a strong philosophical basis to one's practice. And finally, such people who are under delusion and who are very much prone to be deviated, such people, they keep on degrading in the material world. The consciousness keeps on degrading because being in association with the material modes of nature and being in association with the other conditioned living beings, such people who do not make an explicit endeavor of improving their spiritual understanding, such people, their consciousness keeps on degrading. So therefore, it is very much important for us to actually spend some of our time regularly to cultivate that spiritual knowledge on a personal basis for our own betterment, and so that we can also serve the movement of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu in a better manner. So yes, if one doesn't have a strong basis to strong philosophical basis to one's practice, one continues to remain in delusion. There is a very high chance of being deviated from the actual path, from the right path, and one continues to degrade in one's consciousness, being affected, being under the control of the material modes of nature. But then on the other hand, what about those who are actually making this endeavor, like all of the devotees present here, those who are actually making that explicit endeavor in some way or the other, whether it is small or big, but then even that small little endeavor, the Bhagavad Gita mentions that neha abhikrama nashosti pratyavayo na vidyate swalpam api asya dharmasya trayate mahato bhayat. Even a small endeavor made on this path can save one from the greatest fear, and that fear is being repeatedly caught up in the repeated cycle of birth and death in this material world. So for such people who are making that endeavor to cultivate that spiritual knowledge, to give a strong philosophical basis to one's practice of Krishna consciousness, there are three very, very strong effects, very practical benefits that such sadhakas they experience. The very first thing is definiteness. They are very much clear as to why are they doing whatever they are doing. And such people, they have such a clarity of thought. They have that confidence that whatever I am into makes proper sense, and therefore they're not swayed away with what people say about them, with what people kind of point fingers at them, or speak ill about them. But then if there is a strong clarity about spiritual understanding, then there is a sense of definiteness that yes, whatever I am into, this practice of Krishna consciousness is the most prime responsibility, is the most perfect duty. And if you look at the purport, Srila Prabhupada writes that all the devotees must know this philosophy so as not to be embarrassed and insulted when they preach. So this embarrassment or this insult comes when there is a lack of confidence. But then when a person is definite, when there is definiteness in his understanding, in his mentality, and one is clear about why am I doing whatever I am doing, then there is no embarrassment, even though people may speak something ill about them. But then such devotees, they have a counter argument to present, they have a philosophical basis to present before others. And when people, they hear that, when such practitioners, they are actually aware of the purpose for which they are doing whatever they are doing, when people, they actually hear, then they understand that this is not because of some emotional outburst, or this is not because of some just feel good factor, but this person actually knows why should this practice be actually carried out by anyone and everyone. So that's the very first thing that happens when one actually endeavors to develop that strong philosophical basis, is definiteness. The second thing is one gets that determination to continue in spite of difficulties, in spite of challenges, because life in this material world could be tough at times. And I think I would be making an understatement if I say that life could be tough sometimes. But then many a times, or often at times, life keeps presenting us with numerous challenges, with numerous anxieties, with numerous difficulties, or numerous obstructions for us to keep growing in our Krishna consciousness. But again, this is where a strong philosophical repository, a strong philosophical understanding gives us that determination to continue what may come our way. gives us that determination, whether hell or high water, I'll continue, because I have to reach the goal. This goal is something that is very, very sublime. And just like the Bhagavad Gita mentions, bahunam janmanam ante jnanaman mam prapadyate vasudeva sarvamati savahatmasu durlabam. After many, many lifetimes, only a fortunate soul comes to know about me, and such a person is very, very rare. So if someone is very enlightened in the instructions of the scriptures, if someone is having a very strong basis of that spiritual knowledge, one develops that determination to keep continuing. And we find that in our Krishna consciousness movement, we find so many examples in this regard, because even our society has gone through ups and downs, and we find so many of such devotees who have had that determination to continue, to keep, not just continue to, but to keep growing in their own spiritual practice and keep inspiring people in spite of all odds. And that has been because such devotees, they were not practicing devotional service just out of some emotional outburst, or just wanting to look for a feel good factor, but then they actually understood that how this this process of bhakti is something very, very sublime, and something that is very important for every living entity to actually take up and progress on the path of devotion. So that's the second benefit, that apart from having a definiteness, a clarity on the why, one also has that determination to continue the practice of bhakti in spite of difficulties, in spite of challenges, and in spite of any obstacles that one may experience on his path of bhakti. And the third benefit that is also remarkably observed is that such people who have a strong philosophical basis, they are very much decisive. For such sadhakas, it is very easy for them to take decisions, because they're aware as to what is it that will be beneficial for my bhakti in the long run, vis-a-vis what is it that may seem beneficial, but the benefits are very much short-lived. So such sadhakas who have a very strong philosophical basis, it is very, very easy for them to take decisions in life. Anukulasya sankalpaha pratikulasya varjanam. To actually take up those practices which are anukul, which are favorable for the practice of devotional service, and to give up those principles which are detrimental for the progress in our bhakti. So these three effects we can find. These three effects of having a strong philosophical basis to one's practice, that one is definite, one has that definiteness, a clarity on why I'm doing whatever I'm doing. One is determined to carry on in his practice, inner practice, in spite of all odds, and one is very, very decisive. The decision making is very easy for such people, because they know what is anukul for my devotional service, what is favorable for my growth in this process of bhakti, and what is it that may be detrimental for me on the process of bhakti. And therefore, if we look in the Srimad Bhagavatam, in the 7th canto, Sri Prahlad Maharaj, he explains about these nine means of attaining devotional service. And the very first thing he starts with is cultivation of knowledge, or Shravanam. Shravanam, Kirtanam, Vishnu Smaran, the other processes they follow. But then Prahlad Maharaj, he gives the highest priority to cultivation of knowledge by hearing from Guru, by hearing from the scriptures, by hearing from the acharyas, previous acharyas. Srila Narottam Das Thakur, in one of his compositions, he says, Rupa Raghunath Pade Hoibe Akuti, Kabe Ame Bujhabo Se Yugala Piriti. And Srila Prabhupada, he translates this particular song, that Rupa Raghunatha Pade Hoibe Akuti. When is it that I will also follow in the footsteps of Sri Rup and Raghunath Das Goswami? Kabe ame bujhabo se yugala piriti. When is it that I'll actually understand the relationship between Radha and Krishna, the love of Radha and Krishna? And that will only be possible when I follow in the footsteps of Sri Rup and Sanatan Goswami. And in one of the purports of the Chaitanya Charitamrita, Srila Prabhupada writes that Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu directly empowered Sri Rupa Goswami and Srila Sanatan Goswami, and following in their footsteps, the other Goswamis, they understood Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and his mission. So therefore, one should understand Sri Krishna Chaitanya and Lord Sri Krishna from the 6 Goswamis in the parampara system. The Krishna consciousness movement is following as strictly as possible in the footsteps of the Goswamis. In other words, just like even in the Mahabharata, Yudhishthir Maharaj, he says, Mahajano yena gata sapantha, that in order for us to actually progress very, very smoothly and swiftly on the path of devotion, it is very important for us to follow in the footsteps of the previous devotees. And here Srila Prabhupada is giving the examples of the Goswamis, that how Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, he personally instructed Srila Rupa Goswami and Srila Sanatan Goswami. Whereas the other Goswamis, they didn't have that opportunity of receiving direct instructions from Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. But then they associated with Srila Rupa and Sanatan Goswamis, and they learned the process of bhakti from Srila Rupa and Srila Sanatan Goswami. And therefore, Srila Prabhupada writes that just like the other Goswamis, they learned the process of devotion from Rupa and Sanatan Goswami, who learned it from Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu himself. Similarly, we, the followers of the Krishna consciousness movement, are following as strictly as possible in the footsteps of the Goswamis. Now, for us to follow in the footsteps of the Goswamis, what does that mean? It doesn't necessarily mean to actually go and visit all those places where they used to reside and to see their samadhis. All of those things are very much valid and are very good. But then actually following in the footsteps of the Goswamis means to understand the mood and mission of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu as they understood it from the Lord himself. And therefore, in order for us to understand the mood and mission of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, we need to read these compositions. We need to get access to these compositions by the Goswamis and through the translations and purports by Srila Prabhupada himself. And this is one of the beauty that how when Srila Prabhupada writes that the Krishna consciousness movement is following as strictly as possible in the footsteps of the Goswamis, this goes to show that in order for us to also follow in the footsteps of the Supreme Lord Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, in order for us to follow in the footsteps of the Goswamis, we need to follow in the footsteps of Srila Prabhupada himself. How Srila Prabhupada has been helping us to actually follow in the footsteps of the Goswamis so that we learn the mood and mission of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And therefore, on numerous occasions, Srila Prabhupada used to say, read my books. Everything is there in these books. You need not go anywhere else to understand the philosophical basis of bhakti. Everything is there. And all of us know that the kind of endeavor Srila Prabhupada put in, the kind of effort that Srila Prabhupada put in to translate all these Goswami literatures, to translate Srimad Bhagavad Gita, the Srimad Bhagavatam, Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita, and Upadeshamrit, Bhakti Rasamrit Sindhu, and all of these books. How Srila Prabhupada, during the early hours of the day, even before Mangalarti, spending hours together, when it is difficult for us to even be awake, Srila Prabhupada has written such sublime purports to all of these scriptures for us to benefit from them. And therefore, we'll just go through a few of these instructions that Srila Prabhupada mentions with regards to putting in an endeavor in cultivating that spiritual basis. in a lecture at Gorakhpur, this February 1971, Srila Prabhupada writes, Srila Prabhupada is speaking, that the Siddhantic conclusions are being mentioned in all my books. And the boys in our Krishna society should now give more attention for studying the books very attentively. We know that how in the initial days of Krishna consciousness and all through Srila Prabhupada had been emphasizing so much on book distribution. But then repeatedly, whenever he was with his disciples, he would repeatedly emphasize that it is not just sufficient to distribute books, but all the boys and girls in our Krishna society must also give more attention for studying the books very, very attentively. Because Srila Prabhupada knew that it is not just by engaging in the process that they will, keep growing in the path of bhakti. But growing on the path of bhakti is also very much dependent on the growth of one's spiritual understanding, on the growth of one's spiritual knowledge. And therefore, in one of the Madhya Lila purports, Srila Prabhupada writes that in the first wave of the book known as the Bhakti Ratnakar, it is said that Sanatana Goswami understood Srimad Bhagavatam by thorough study and explained it in his commentary known as Vaishnava Toshani. All the knowledge that Sri Sanatana Goswami and Rupa Goswami directly acquired from Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was broadcast all over the world by their expert service. And then Srila Prabhupada writes, please listen very carefully. He writes something very, very important. Prabhupada writes that if one studies a particular book, he must do so thoroughly. That is the principle. By thoroughly studying a limited number of books, one can understand the philosophy. What to talk if one actually is able to go through the entire gamut of shastras that Srila Prabhupada has translated for us. But Prabhupada writes that even though one thoroughly studies a limited number of books, and Prabhupada specifically says that if one thoroughly studies the Bhagavad Gita, the Srimad Bhagavatam, and the Nectar of Devotion, and of course Chaitanya Charitamrita, just a few of these books, if one studies very, very scrutinizingly, one can understand the philosophy, to a very, very large extent. In another lecture at Los Angeles, this is June of 1972, he writes that Sri Parikshit Maharaj, he attained self-realization only in 7 days. And he gives that, how was that possible? Because he was serious. And then Prabhupada writes that we are not so serious. Prabhupada is speaking in this lecture that Parikshit Maharaj could attain self-realization in 7 days because he was very serious in getting spiritual knowledge from Sukadeva Goswami. But Prabhupada says we are not so serious because we are thinking we shall live for 7 millions of years. So let me go slowly. Better utilize the time by sleeping. That is our position. If you have got some time, take this opportunity by sleeping, not reading the books. So Prabhupada is kind of hinting at the mentality of the conditioned soul that, manda sumanda matayo. So if you do not become serious, then it will take many, many years. So Prabhupada is giving this sort of a warning that if you do not become serious, then it will take many, many years. But we should be serious more than Sukadeva or Parikshit Maharaj. This again phenomenal. Prabhupada is mentioning that we should be serious more than Sukadev or Parikshit Maharaj. Parikshit Maharaj had at least time limit 7 days, but we do not know whether we will live again 7 minutes. Any moment your heart can fail. This is Srila Prabhupada just quoting him, this lecture in Los Angeles in June 1972. Again, it's not just it's not for us to get panicky about it, and it's not just for us to become very much concerned, but the whole point is all of these purports, all of these classes, all of these instructions of Srila Prabhupada are for us to develop that desire to grow in bhakti by developing this proper knowledge. So yes, developing this proper knowledge is something that will help not ourselves, but will also help us represent the movement in a very, very strong manner. And just like in the beginning, we mentioned that proper knowledge along with proper conduct is what will make us good representatives. The expectations that the Vishnu Dutas are having from the Yam Dutas of knowing the philosophy nicely, as well as, conducting themselves based on that philosophical understanding. So the next thing, the second thing, the first qualification, the first prerequisite of becoming a good representative is having proper knowledge. And along with proper knowledge, there has to be proper conduct. The Bhagavad Gita mentions that the symptom of a learned person is that such a person is humble in his behavior, has that humility. Vidya Vinaya Sampanne. The symptom of a person who has Vidya, one who has spiritual knowledge, is that one has Vinaya, or one has humility. Now, what does that humility means? Humility means to be actually aware of what to do and what not to do. When to do, when not to do. All of these aspects, being very, very sensitive, being very, very conscientious of one's activity, and to carry out in the right mood. So based on the knowledge, how should one's conduct be? How should one's activity be? How should one's actions be? So what to do, what not to do. So here we find that just like we discussed, this was an emergency situation. The soul was being pulled out from the body of Ajamil, and the Vishnu Dutas, in this emergency situation, they came over and they saw that the Yam Dutas are like, they're in action. So the Vishnu Dutas, they didn't attack the Yam Dutas. It is very important for us to note this. The Vishnu Dutas, they just stopped the Yam Dutas from taking the soul, and they challenged the understanding of the Yamadutas. This is a very, very example of a very refined behavior, because typically we find that whenever there is a spurt of action happening, there is retaliation. So the Vishnu Dutas, they could have waged out a war, or they could have directly attacked the Yamadutas, but they didn't do that. They were very refined in their behavior, so they just stopped the Yamadutas from taking Ajamil, and they challenged the understanding of the Yamdutas. And it's also very important for us to note that how even the Yamdutas, they didn't protest, or they didn't start fighting back when they were stopped by the Vishnu Dutas. Whereas when they were challenged, when they were questioned by the Vishnu Dutas, we find that in the next 30 verses, the Vishnu Dutas, they're actually answering what the Yamdutas are actually answering what the Vishnu Dutas wanted to know. The Vishnu Dutas had asked about the principles of religion and the principles of irreligion. And we find that till the end of this particular chapter, the Yamdutas are answering the queries of the Vishnu Dutas. And therefore, the Yamdutas, they actually justified their actions. They didn't kind of retaliate. They didn't start fighting back, and they didn't start protest. Oh, why are you, interfering in our job, and will kind of finish you off and everything. But then they actually retracted, and they understood that maybe here is an opportunity for us to upgrade our understanding. And the Yamdutas, when they actually go to Yamaraj, they actually question Yamaraj that, look, this is what our standard of knowledge was. This is what we had heard from you. But looks like there is something higher that is yet to be known. And therefore, this is, again, there is something to learn even from the Yamdutas. It's very surprising. But then, if you observe very carefully, these examples find a mention in the Srimad Bhagavatam, because they have a lot to teach us. Because many a times, even we are very much attached to what we know, and we may not be willing to upgrade our understanding and to improve our standard of knowledge. But here the Yamdutas, when they are questioned, they actually retract, they go to Yamaraj, and they make an attempt to upgrade their level of understanding. And this is a very, very very decent behavior, both on the part of the Vishnu Dutas not attacking the Yamdutas, thinking them to be wrong, and also on the part of the Yamdutas, not just counteracting and not just protesting and fighting back, but actually going to Yamraj and wanting to upgrade their knowledge. So a good behavior, a good conduct on the part of the representative, which Srila Prabhupada writes, indicates or denotes the good training of the master. So the Vishnu Dutas were trained by Lord Vishnu himself, and they kept the position of, they maintained the position, they upheld the training of their master. And similarly, the Yamdutas, they also upheld the position of Yamraj. They didn't kind of put Yamraj in shame by acting in an inappropriate manner. But then this appropriate behavior on both of their part actually denotes good training of the master, Lord Vishnu and Yamraj himself. And similarly, when we have proper conduct as devotees of the Krishna consciousness movement, that is a glorification of the parampara, that is a glorification of all the previous acharyas, and that is a glorification of the training that we have received from Guru, Sadhu and Shastras. And we find that, people in general, when they find devotees behaving very in a very refined manner, in a very decent manner, people actually appreciate that. Look at these Hare Krishnas, look at or in India here they say, अरे ये ISKCON वाले कितना अच्छा कीर्तन करते हैं, ये ISKCON वाले actually अच्छा प्रसाद खिलाते हैं, and so on and so forth. So there actually, people are very appreciative when they see good conduct on part of the devotees. And on the other hand, when there is not such a nice conduct, or in other words, humility, the another aspect of conduct is also understanding what not to do. So knowing one's boundaries, basically. So there are the gross boundaries and there are the subtle boundaries. As sadhakas, as practitioners of the Krishna consciousness movement, as aspirants of good representatives, if we want to become good representatives of Lord Chaitanya, if we have that aspiration, there are some boundaries that are expected for us to adhere to. And the gross boundaries, we know how there are the gross boundaries of the regulative principles, where it is mentioned that, what are the principles that we are expected to follow. And when people see that the practice, these devotees in the Krishna consciousness movement, they're actually very much consistent in the way, in their food habits, or in the way they have their schedules, in the way they kind of interact with people. When people find this consistency, they appreciate. And in the Upadeshamrit also, again, Srila Rupa Goswami mentions the unfavorable practices for devotional service: satyahara prayasascha prajalpo niyamagraha janasangasya lolyam cha shadvir bhakti vinashyati. So those 6 practices which actually degrade one's consciousness or degrade one's bhakti, Rupa Goswami mentions in the Upadeshamrit. So there are these gross boundaries that all of us are aware of, that as sadhakas, as practitioners, as good representatives of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, of Srila Prabhupada, we are expected to follow. But then over and above the gross boundaries, there are the subtle boundaries also. What are those subtle boundaries? Subtle boundaries means being aware of one's adhikar, or behaving appropriately according to time, place, circumstances, according to the person in front of us. So a very beautiful example in this regard I can think from the disciples of Srila Prabhupada, or even Srila Prabhupada himself, when he used to be with the reporters, when he used to be with the disciples, when he used to be with other leaders of great religious movements, we find in the life of Srila Prabhupada how Srila Prabhupada used to carry himself in a very dignified manner, how Srila Prabhupada used to carry himself in a very aristocratic manner, or in a very at the same time having the demeanor of a humble saint. So this unique combination, how Srila Prabhupada he understood that being a representative of a worldwide movement, he had this responsibility. And if we study the life of Srila Prabhupada, there is so much to learn from his life. So therefore, again, proper conduct has both of these aspects of understanding what to do and what not to do. So it is said that good conduct is born out of a good consciousness, which in turn is a result of good cultivation of knowledge. If one has a good cultivation of knowledge, one's consciousness will be good. And if there is good consciousness, naturally the conduct will be good. So therefore, it should be our aspiration to work on both of these fronts, to have the good cultivation of knowledge, so that we develop good consciousness, and which will manifest itself in a good conduct, in a good behavior before others. And just like in this purport, Srila Prabhupada is mentioning, we'll end up with this last thing, that how the Vishnu Dutas, they ask the Yamadutas about actual principle of religion. And Srila Prabhupada writes that just to eradicate any kind of doubt, Prabhupada puts it very, very clear that surrender unto the Supreme Personality of Godhead is the actual principle of religion. And Prabhupada quotes this verse, Sarva Dharman Parityajya Mamekam Sharanam Vraja Aham Tvam Sarva Papebhyo Mokshayishyami Ma Suchaha. And we find that in this particular verse, Lord Krishna himself, he is mentioning that how good conduct and good consciousness gives birth to good consequence. Sarva Dharman Parityajya, put aside all other varieties of religion, or put aside all other priorities that we may consider it as a higher priority than the practice of bhakti. Put all of those priorities aside and keep Krishna consciousness or the practice of devotional service as the highest priority in your life. So Sarva Dharman Parityajya, this is how the conduct of a devotee should be. In what consciousness? Mam ekam sharanam vraja, considering me to be the only shelter. Mam ekam sharanam vraja. And then what will be the consequence if one has this consciousness and if one has such a conduct? The consequence will be aham tvam sarva papebhyo mokshayishyami ma sucha. I will relieve you from the reactions of all previous sinful activities. Do not fear, don't have a confusion in this regard. And therefore, once again, this episode wherein Ajamil receives a second chance by unconscious performance of pure devotional service, we find that even by an unconscious execution of pure devotional service, just by calling out the name of his son Narayan in utter helplessness, Ajamil received this another chance. What to say if there is a conscious practice that is done in full understanding, in full faith, and in full sincerity? And therefore the Shastras mentions Avashya Rakshibe Krishna Vishwas Palan. Definitely Krishna will protect if there is this firm faith in the words of the Supreme Lord. So just to end up at that we discussed that how in this particular purport, Srila Prabhupada highlights the importance of becoming a good representative of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, of the six Goswamis, of the Krishna consciousness movement. And we discussed two aspects. What will help us be good representatives is a nice solid philosophical understanding and a proper conduct. So proper knowledge and proper conduct is what will help us become good practitioners of, or good representatives of the movement of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. I think I'll end up at that. If anyone has any questions, we can take up a few questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much for Prabhuji for this very detailed session on how to be a proper representative of Krishna conscious devotee. Thank you. Thank you so much, Prabhuji. And the importance of having proper knowledge is really very helpful. Thank you so much. Yes, Prabhuji, there is no hand raised, but I will see in the chat there are some comments.
Hare Krishna, Mataji, Sukara Krishna Das has his hand raised.
You can. Yes, Mataji. Archana Dattar, Mataji, you can please ask the question.
Yes, Hare Krishna Prabhuji. Thank you for the wonderful class. Like Ajamil used to chant the name of his son Narayana. So my question was regarding my mother. When I request her to chant on the japa beat, she tells me that no, I am continuously chanting in my mind. I cannot chant on the japa beats, but I am chanting in my mind. So does that help? Because I don't know what she's doing. I cannot hear it. So does chanting in the mind have any? Is it helpful?
What I could say in this at this is it all depends on the consciousness of a person, and the whole process of bhakti is a very, very deep process. The Supreme Lord is present as Paramatma within the heart of every living being, and the Shvetashvatara Upanishad gives the example of two birds sitting on the branch of a same tree, wherein one bird is engaged in eating the fruits of the tree and the second bird is just watching the first bird. And this particular example, Srila Prabhupada, he elaborates that how the Paramatma is actually witnessing the intention of the living being. So if that intention is good enough, if that intention or sincerity is there to actually take shelter of the Supreme Lord, even though one chants in the mind, it has the same benefit. It will have the same benefit. But then, sometimes it is observed that, people, they want to take a side route and just escape from the expectation of others, wherein, sometimes people expect a lot from us, that we should be practicing devotional service like this and like that, and just escape from those expectations. We say, no, I am always chanting and I always think of Krishna. But then actually it's not that easy. It's not that easy to always keep chanting in one's mind. If one is doing, it's brilliant. It's brilliant. I mean, that is what Krishna wants. Man mana bhava mad bhakto. Always think of me. Krishna doesn't say that always speak up and keep loudly chanting my names. That is for us to develop a habit so that we can be always thinking about Krishna. Man mana bhav mad bhakto, or satatam kirtayanto mam, when Krishna says. So satatam kirtayanto mam may not necessarily mean that one should be always be with one's beads and be chanting, but the whole process that has been given to by the Goswamis, Sankhya Purvaka Nama Gana Natibhi, when the Goswamis, they mentions that how one should be very diligently and explicitly performing devotional service. The benefit is that currently the mind is not under our control, and the mind keeps on wandering in 10 different directions, in not 10 different directions, hundreds of directions, and therefore when the body is engaged in a particular practice, that helps the mind to also focus on that particular practice. And therefore the external practice of the process is very much important in order to focus the mind. Now again, this applies to someone whose mind is definitely restless. If someone's mind is actually peaceful, if someone's mind is actually focused always in thinking about Krishna, is always filled with desires of pleasing Krishna, naturally such a person will always keep chanting or will always keep desiring how to please Krishna. And therefore, like in the beginning I mentioned that bhakti is a very internal thing. It's not an external thing, because externally one might take that practice of Krishna consciousness, but then if there is no internal change of heart, if the mind is still while chanting or even while not chanting, if the mind is completely out of order, so then actually that external practice is also doesn't make much sense. So the whole practice, the whole objective of having a external practice is to bring the mind under control, so that ultimately, because at the end of one's life, when one is expected to give up this body, we don't know if we'll be actually be able to chant the holy names in an explicit manner externally, but that is when the mind actually plays a part. That is when the mind actually thinks about Krishna. And therefore Krishna says antakalecha mam eva smaran muktva kalevran. If one remembers me at the time of the death. So this remembrance is a function of the mind. And in order for us to train the mind, there has to be an external practice, because we can't just train the mind internally. Only when the body is engaged in a particular way, the mind also starts slowly and gradually focusing. Just like when a small child is told, you should study, the child would never study. But when the child is made to put that school uniform and said that now you have to board the school bus, now you have to go to this particular school, enter this particular classroom, here are your books. So when there are a lot of external facilities, slowly and gradually the child picks up, and internally his desire changes that yes, life is not just fun and play, life is meant for some serious study too. So similarly, if we coming back to your question, Mataji, if we can put forth this proposal to your mother that for us to actually keep the mind always thinking about Krishna, and it's very easy to find out if the mind is actually thinking about Krishna, because depending on the quality of thinking, feeling and willing, what are the desires, what are the priorities, what are the expectations, that would show what is the quality of the thinking of the mind. And if there is a improvement that is required therein, wherein the mind is actually going in different directions and not focused, then such a proclamation that I am always chanting may not be acceptable. And there might be a need of an external practice in order to put the mind back on track, so that the mind gets trained in remembering Krishna. So training always requires endeavor. Training is not an automatic thing. Just like a child is trained to study from the very beginning, or we find even the monkeys are trained, said that mind is just like a monkey, keeps hovering in different directions, unpredictable ways, where it will jump and one branch to another. So just like a monkey, if a monkey is actually trained, repeatedly is made to perform a particular task, the monkey also understands that this is what I'm expected to do. So similarly, the expectation from a clean mind is to think always of Krishna. And in order to facilitate that, there has to be an external setup of cultivating that practice. I don't know if that answers your question.
Such a beautiful answer, Prabhu. I'm going to share this recording with my mother. Thank you so much.
Hare Krishna, and please beg forgiveness if she doesn't like the answer.
No, Prabhu, it is very nice. Thank you.
Hare Krishna. I think
you, Mataji, for that
we have a
beautiful
few more
question.
questions.
Yes, Prabhu. We'll request Sukkokar Krishna Prabhu, you can ask your question.
Hare Krishna, Prabhu, super class.
Hare Krishna, Dandavat Pranam,
Yes,
Prabhuji.
Prabhu, you are unmuted.
Okay, now Prabhuji, now we have got this three mind: conscious mind, subconscious mind, and unconscious mind. Okay, conscious mind, now you are giving a lecture, I'm hearing your speech. Unconscious mind, when you get operated, we are not knowing, not conscious. But the subconscious mind, I want to activate. See, what I'm doing is I'm having a clicker in my head. Throughout the day, I'm trying to either be in class or chanting or something. And this I'm just trying to, as you told, no, that Manmanabham Labda is not coming. But I'm forcefully just, from morning till now, only 93 times I have chanted. That means I have not activated. So this gives a reminder, 8 hours gone and you have chanted only 110. That means you're not done. But then I will look back, as I was doing this work, I was doing that work related to Krishna only. I'm a retired person. So how to make it subconscious? like suppose I'm going from every day from Chembur to Sion, my car. But suddenly my wife tells you, today go to Dadar. And I land up in Sion and then I say, oh, I have to go to. So that is the subconscious mind. So how to make Krishna conscious as subconscious, though I'm doing Bhagavatam and all, still not able to remember 24/7, not able to chant. So I am doubtful at the time of death what will happen, whether I will remember or not, because I'm not doing it. I'm a chartered accountant, retired now. I'm 24 hours trying this. But still, I want your suggestion or advice how to make it subconscious 24/7. There's no thing other than Krishna.
Yeah, actually, Prabhuji, this is actually a very, very exalted state wherein one 24/7 is perfectly conscious of Krishna and has no other desire but to please Krishna. I mean, this is actually the consciousness of the Goswamis if we look very scrutinizingly. But the process still remains the same. The process remains that a proper practice is what will help us achieve that perfection. And I'm pretty much sure that because you are actually engaged, and even though you might not be remembering the classes, even though you might not be remembering what all we have heard, or but then we know for sure that each of the experiences of Krishna consciousness has strengthened our desire from within, has given us that confidence, that yes, my life has to be for Krishna. So even though currently it might not be the case, even though currently in the whole day you might have chanted just 100 times, but then still, because the desire is getting stronger by the day, over a period of time, and with regards to the time of leaving the body, I think we shouldn't be too panicky about it. We shouldn't be too much thinking about it, because actually we don't have so much control, over our thoughts when that moment arrives. And therefore it is a prerogative of Krishna. We understand our responsibility and we perform our responsibility to the best of our intentions and to the best of our capability, to the best of the strength that we have, to the best of the facilities that we have, and we leave the rest to Krishna. Whatever Krishna desires. If he wants us to give a second chance, third chance, or want to just take us to his abode, or may want us to experience a bit more of the material world, it's okay. That is his desire, and we respect the desire of the Lord, and we abide by the desire of the Lord, knowing very well that the arrangement of the Lord, everyone, Krishna has a plan for everyone, and no matter however distorted that plan might seem to us, that plan is always and always beautiful, even though we might not be able to perceive that beauty today. So therefore, I think instead of focusing too much about the result, instead of focusing too much about what's going to happen when things will be different and tough times will be there, instead of thinking all of that, I think we should be thinking more about the pastimes mentioned in the Krishna book, and being engaged in that practice. Does that answer your question, Prabhu? To some extent,
but what I'm trying is, now when you are giving lectures, this Sangha is really beautiful. I make full notes and I try to pass it on to 4-5 other people, either by notes or by calling and talking, preach. Brilliant. So that it's a preaching for me, first of all.
Yeah.
And beyond that, morning around the 25-30 rounds, the morning there's a Zoom preaching, we do the chanting. But as you said, not to be perplexed or be anxious, leave it to Krishna and keep doing the best. And that will bring. So
thank you so much,
Prabhuji. Thank you very much.
I think we have a few more hands raised up. Bhagavati Mataji, who would you like to?
Yes, Prabhu, I'm requesting out ask her question.
Hare Krishna, Prabhuji. Thank you so much, Prabhuji, for beautiful enlightening class. Prabhuji, my question is around cultivation of knowledge. So when I think about cultivation of knowledge, it always comes to me, my mind is about jnanis. And also, if we see the Anyabhlashta Sunyam. So when we focus on cultivation of knowledge, that should not be covered by bhakti. Senior
I got
devotees.
your question. Yeah. So basically, repeatedly we hear in Prabhupada purports that, the bhaktis are higher than the jnanis and ashtang yogis, but at the same time, these are particular levels. And if we analyze our level, we find that actually we are way down even when compared to the jnanis. The objective or the purpose why Prabhupada is writing that one should not be focused on the cultivation of jnana, that is not to undermine the process of cultivating knowledge, but that is for the purpose of not stopping there, not just stopping and considering that this is it, but to keep moving ahead. Even in the Gita, Arjuna didn't just stop at Gyan Yoga. He learned so much about Krishna, but then Krishna he actually inspired him to move ahead, and practice, get to the platform of bhakti. So yes, when we hear that we are the bhakti yogis are higher than the jnanis and the karmis, it also is very much important for us to take a stock of our situation. Where are we in life today? When we talk about the jnanis, even the jnanis, okay, here we are not talking about the confused jnanis. Here we are talking, first of all, is cultivation of spiritual knowledge. We are not talking about just mugging up the entire, this Samhita and that Purana and that Upanishad. But here we are talking about that gyan, that adhyatmic gyan from the Vedas, which will help us actually reach Krishna. Vedanta krit ved videva chaham. The purpose of learning the Vedas is to understand Krishna. Krishna mentions in the Bhagavad Gita. So he himself defines the purpose of cultivating gyan. The purpose of cultivating gyan is to reach to the platform wherein we understand the position of Krishna and we engage in his service. So that is the purpose of Gyan. When we talk about the Gyanis, typically what happens is such a Gyan which is devoid of service to Krishna, that Gyan produces false confidence or produces that ahankar, mithya ahankar of knowing too much, and posing before the entire world as learned people. So such Gyanis are condemned in the Shastras. But when Gyana, just like we saw, Vidya Vinaya Sampanne, when that Gyana gives rise to humility, and in other words, when that Gyana gives rise to a humble practice of devotional service, that Gyana is something that each of one should be aspiring for. So I think that is what is my understanding regarding. Does that help, Mataji?
Yes, definitely, Prabhuji. It helps a lot. Prabhuji, my follow-up question is, I was about to ask about in the process of even in the Bhakti Yoga, right, Prabhuji, like we need to understand the scriptures from different perspectives, not necessarily every time from devotional perspective, when we maybe Canto 2, Canto 5. So at the time, in the context of philosophical understanding, we should not get deviated from the devotion. But every time I'm talking about myself when I read the purport, it's more kind of understanding and also interpretation, analysis. So sometimes I feel like I'm deviating from what I should understand from devotion perspective.
That is because we are unable to figure out the connection. When Sukadeva Goswami is explaining about the creation, or when he's explaining about the descriptions of hellish planets, apparently it might seem that it is not connected to devotion. But then a person like Parikshit Maharaj, why would Sukadeva Goswami in such a short period of time discuss topics which are not related to cultivating devotion to the Supreme Lord? Because the whole objective of their discussion in those 7 days was to prepare Parikshit Maharaj in getting to the platform of very intense devotional service, in having his heart fully absorbed in Krishna. And therefore, unless and until each of these topics have that connection of invoking devotion. Sukhdev Goswami would have never discussed it in the first place. So therefore, instead of trying to demarcate them as different, instead of marking them as philosophy, marking them as analytical study, marking them as just a description of the structure of the universe and so on and so forth, if we are able to find that connection as to how these are also a explanation of the qualities of the Lord, these are also explanations about the greatness of the Supreme Lord, and as we grow in our own devotion, we are able to appreciate Krishna through all of these means, that how Krishna has such beautifully he has created a material world for the implementation of the desires of even the conditioned souls, how there are systems and laws in place. So if we understand these things in the right perspective from the right source, and the more we kind of grow in our devotion, that's most important actually, because in the initial days it might seem to be kind of not interrelated, but then as we grow in our own bhakti, we are able to figure out that connection. What is that connection? What is because of these attributes, it is easier for me to appreciate the greatness of the Lord. Because of these attributes, it is easier for me to see the beautiful systems that are set by the Lord. So I think everything in the Shastras is actually connecting to developing that devotion within our hearts, and therefore we have to be patient. Srila Rupa Goswami mentions that utsahat nishchayat dhairyat. We should be enthusiastic in going through all of those things, and we should be nishchayat, we should be determined in actually understanding, in trying to learn as much as possible. At the same time, dhairyat, we shouldn't be impatiently coming to conclusions that this is what it is and this is different, this is devotion, this is not devotion, this is just a analytical study of the 24 elements, this is just a description of the creation, so this is different, this is different. Let's not come to conclusions so early. Let us be patient and just go through it, and as we go through it, as we again so this entire thing is a process of bhakti, and as we engage ourselves in this process of bhakti, very soon we are able to find that connection, and very soon we are able to understand that how everything actually has to do with cultivating that devotion within our hearts. Hope that answers your question, Mataji.
Definitely, Prabhuji. Definitely. Thank you so much, Prabhuji. Hare Krishna.
Hare
Thank you so much, Mataji. So next I request Prahlad Anand Prabhuji, you can ask your question, and at last Sureshwar Shyam Prabhu.
Thank you very much, Mataji.
Prahlad Anand Prabhu, you can ask it.
Thank you very much, Mataji. Can you? I'm audible there.
Yes, Prabhuji. You are
Thank you very much. Yes, and I'm grateful for this all the knowledge I received from Chaitanya Lila Prabhuji. So my Danvat Pranam. In developing whatever knowledge I have developed about bhakti and from Prabhupada Maharaj books and all that from 1984 till today, I understand first step is to imbibe all the knowledge Prabhupada Maharaj has given in Srimad Bhagavatam and all his literature. And in addition to that, in my own experience, I have found so much connection with interplay of the super soul. Because whenever there, as you were mentioning about, there are so many storms which come facing, our practice and all that. I always got some indication somewhere through agency of super soul, which solves my problem. Right? So I understand that there is, in addition to studying and imbibing this knowledge, there is an element always response from Lord Krishna, and as a super soul level. And I was hearing also that in connection to Ata Shri Krishna Namadina Bhavet Grahyam Indra Sevan Mukheji was Swayam Spurat. So this Swayam Spurat, is it connection with the super soul? And
definitely.
Yes. And is there any role of Niskam Karma? I mean, Niskam Karma with developing applied spiritual knowledge in your life. Because these I have heard in so many lectures, which say that niskam karma, let alone yoga, but niskam karma alone is so much effective tool in applied spiritual knowledge in your life. Not the theory, but the applied. So I want you to highlight that portion of niskam. Does it help in any way like that?
Yeah, again, Prabhuji, when we speak about Nishkam Karma Yoga, it is more about the consciousness of action. So, bhakti is again a very deep science of how we apply our consciousness in pleasing Krishna. And it's not very much it's not very much judged by the external activity. Just like when Arjuna was fighting on the battlefield of Kurukshetra, he was into a lot of fierce activities, but because the intent, because his consciousness was to please Krishna through his activities, so that activity actually pleased Krishna, and Arjuna derived the benefits. So yes, definitely when we talk about Nishkama Karma Yoga, it definitely leads us to the platform of completely satisfying Krishna. But then even to come to that stage of Nishkama Karma Yoga, sometimes there could be a lot of endeavor, a lot of practice that might be required, because it's not that easy. Because the conditioning of the mind since time immemorial has been so intense to enjoy the fruits of one's activity, that to reach to that position of Nishkama Karma Yoga, still needs a lot of practice. And sometimes, when we read about all of these stages, about Karma Yoga, Sakama Karma Yoga, and then Nishkama Karma Yoga, and observing a few of our traits, someone might think that, okay, now I have come to this platform of Nishkama Karma Yoga. But then actually that platform of Nishkama Karma Yoga is a very, very exalted state, a state in which Arjuna was acting, a state in which all the Pandavas were acting, that even though they were deprived of all of their kingdom, they were deprived of all of their opulences, still they were working for the satisfaction of the Supreme Lord. So the Shastras, the Bhagavad Gita, the Bhagavatam, they present us the complete picture, a whole complete picture. And our spiritual guides, spiritual master, and the devotees in general, they actually help us understand where we are in that big picture. Just like when you look at the layout of a garden, at the entrance, there is that arrow, you are here, correct? So similarly, when we look at the scriptures, when we find these progressions mentioned in the Bhagavad Gita, the progressions mentioned, the stages of devotional service, starting from Ado Shraddha, Sadhu Sangha, Bhajan Kriya, and then so the devotees actually help us identify that where are we currently, and still there might be a distance that would be there for us to cover. So it is always safe for us to think ourselves at the bottom rung,
yes.
Keep putting that endeavor instead of trying to find examples in our life where we have acted based on Nishkama Karma Yoga. So Krishna definitely gives us those glimpses where we also act in a selfless manner. We also perform devotional service, those glimpses of pure devotional service. But at the same time, to be on a safer side, it's always good to kind of convince ourselves that there is still a long way for me to go, and still let me perform this practice of devotional service, this Vaidhi sadhana bhakti, so that one day I reach to that particular platform.
Thank you very much, Prabhuji, for allowing me this.
I think we have one more hand raised. No, two more hand raised.
Yes, Suresh.
Krishna
You
Prabhu.
have time, Prabhu?
Yeah, I'm okay.
Hare Krishna Prabhuji. Thank you, Prabhu, for your nice
Hare
class.
Krishna.
Prabhuji, one question I had. How long Like while Ajamil was on his deathbed, how long this conversation was going on, Prabhuji, between Vishnu Dutas and Yamadutas?
Well, I don't have the statistical figures of how long this conversation went on, but more important than the duration of the conversation is the quality of the conversation, because we will benefit more from the quality of the conversation that is happening and the lessons that we learn from the behavior of both the Vishnu Dutas and the Yam Dutas, and the way things are moving ahead. Because again, one reason why we could have such a doubt is typically we find that in this world conclusions are achieved by longer meetings. We find in this world that the longer the meetings are, the more definite the conclusions are. But then in spiritual perspective, the Vishnu Dutas, they are point blank. The first question they ask is like hitting the target. And the Yamdutas, they are also not beating around the bush. As we'll see in the next 28 or 30 verses till the end of the current chapter, we'll find that the Yamdutas are replying just perfect, based on their understanding. But then the Yamdutas, they also understand that there are levels of knowledge. They might be at a certain level of understanding, but then they also have that humility of approaching Yamaraj and wanting to upgrade their level of knowledge. So similarly, it's not important as to how long that conversation went. I mean, we don't know exactly for sure, because none of the scriptures actually mention that whether it was 20 minutes, 30 minutes, or whatever. So the scriptures always kind of help us get the essence. So the essence of conversation is more important than the duration of the conversation. And this is what precisely the Bhagavat kind of trains us into, in trying to catch that essence.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Makes sense. Asha Mataji, would you like to ask your question now?
Yeah. Hare Krishna, Prabhuji.
Thank you, Prabhuji. Hare Krishna, Prabhu.
Hare Krishna, Prabhuji. Please accept my humble obeisances at your feet. I had only one question, because all the questions come and end at one point. How can one remain in Krishna consciousness, whether it is bhakti, whether it is knowledge, which is His grace? How can you remain in that without the conceptualization, without the judgment, or without the thought of I and me, which is basically without those how much I did in bhakti, how much I did in intellectual this thing, and just remain at His lotus feet without the I and me interference. So there is no complexities of this I and me coming in between. Just remain in Krishna consciousness, not judging too much about individual situation, status, or position, whether it is bhakti or whether it is knowledge. How can you remain like that? Because ultimately, every question that we ask, or every question that comes up, is coming in that intellectual complexities of materialistic individuality. How can you just delete that? I don't know if my question is also right, Prabhuji, but everything ends there.
Yeah.
Thank you,
I would like to put before you a very beautiful pastime of Srila Prabhupada in this regard. One time Srila Prabhupada, he was speaking to a reporter, and the reporter was asking, Swamiji, you have written so many books, and you're traveling all over the world, you're speaking to such great religious leaders, and sometimes what you speak is very difficult to understand. So Srila Prabhupada replied that Krishna consciousness is actually very simple. Krishna consciousness is simple for the simple and complicated for the complicated. And then Srila Prabhupada said that if you want to understand this Krishna consciousness movement through your complex mind, with a lot of what is it about this and this philosophical conception, and how the creation is, and how the systems of, how the laws of nature work, Prabhupada said, we have 80 titles of books for you to understand all of these complexities. Everything is explained in perfect detail. And then Srila Prabhupada, he says that otherwise the Krishna consciousness movement is very simple. Just chant Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. Just by engaging in this process of chanting, you will achieve all perfection. Coming back to your question, Mataji, is, how can we remain in Krishna consciousness? If we just have a few genuinely practicing good friends with us, and we are into the practice of bhakti along with these friends, it is as simple as that. But at the same time, this simple practice of Krishna consciousness, we also need to have deep roots, just like I was mentioning in my class earlier, that because life could be turbulent at times, and therefore we also need to prepare for those turbulences. Just like a captain of a ship, when he goes out into the sea, so why, even though the sea might be calm when the journey begins, but still the captain prepares for eventualities. What if the sea turns rough tomorrow? What if there are high tidal waves? So taking all of those situations into consideration, the captain of the ship actually makes arrangements for lifeboats, for those life jackets, and so on and so forth. So similarly, as devotees, we know that as long as we are still in this bhavasagar, we are still in this material world, the perplexities of the material world will definitely keep tormenting us, even though we want to be simple. But the nature of this material world is that it won't allow us to be quiet and simple, but then it will pose before us numerous challenges, numerous difficulties. And as a determined sadhakas, we should prepare ourselves to cross those difficulties, to cross those challenges, and keep continuing with our devotional service, keep chanting the holy names of the Lord, keep practicing bhakti, with a simple heart. So on one hand, definitely our desire is not to rack our brains through a lot of philosophical juggling and everything, but at the same time we also need to kind of train our minds to deal with those difficulties. What if we come before people in our day-to-day, maybe even in our family or in our job, or our close ones? What if today they become they start challenging our practice of Krishna consciousness? At least we should be able to convince ourselves that whatever we are into is the right path. We shouldn't be simple to the extent that we are convinced by any challenges and we subscribe that, yeah, what you're saying makes sense, and let me just put this aside, and let me continue my simplicity by adopting what you are mentioning. That simplicity is not what Krishna expects. Krishna expects a simplicity of heart, but at the same time a simple heart and a determined heart. A simple heart and a heart who has that utsaha, who has that nishchaya, and who has that dhairya. So all of these qualities put together will be able to please Krishna. If we just want to be kind of very passive and I just want to sit in a corner and just be engaged in chanting, not so much of then it might be difficult for us to actually face the difficulties, face the challenges which life might present before us. So just like an expert captain, we should also prepare our devotional life for eventualities. Does that help in any way, Mataji?
Yes, Prabhuji, that helps. But I just wanted to only know that how can you be in that, be prepared without the I and me coming in between? Like sometimes, when you are in this path of devotion or your intellectual knowledge or whatever it is, you have that I and me always. Like, every question that arises, how much I have been progressing, how much I am here in this, or how will Krishna be pleased? So
actually,
that one should, that sometimes that is like, I feel that is like a hindrance, because there is a lot of I and me coming up. So
if we are, I think it's not wrong. It's not wrong to think about oneself in connection to Krishna, because that relationship between the jiva and the Supreme Lord involves both the parties. As long as we are present, even in the spiritual world, the residents of the spiritual world, they also think that how can I please Krishna? When we look at the residents of Vraja, Yashoda Mai, she was constantly thinking that, how should I prepare, butter in such a way which Krishna will like? Or Srimati Radharani was thinking, what preparation would I make today so that Krishna will be pleased? So definitely a devotee always thinks about himself, not for the purpose of one's enjoyment. So if the deciding factor is who is the benefactor, the deciding factor is who is the enjoyer of our activity or our consciousness. And as long as we are expecting Krishna to be benefited by our plans, by our activities, I think thinking about one's devotional growth or thinking about one's desires to please Krishna is perfectly justified. We shouldn't want to completely remove ourselves from the picture, that I won't think of myself ever, I'll only and only think of Krishna. Maybe that's not natural. Because we have that relationship with Krishna, and naturally we will be thinking about our capabilities, we will be thinking about our strengths, our weaknesses, about the opportunities before us, about the difficulties and challenges before us, for the purpose of growing and serving Krishna in a better manner. So I think definitely it's not natural to completely remove that feeling of I and mine. Instead, that I and mine could be combined with a we factor. Let us together, in the association of devotees, how could we please Krishna? How could we look at this opportunity of serving Krishna, or how could we together handle this difficulty or this challenge before us? So if we combine that factor of so does that help, Madhvi?
Yes, Prabhuji, that really helps. So without the ego factor, just being as a devotee and pleasing Krishna, that is, whatever we do is basically for Krishna only. So just remain in that without the ego factor coming up. Right, Prabhuji?
Correct.
Okay. Thank you, Prabhuji. Thank you so much. Hare Krishna.
Thank you, Prabhuji. Prabhuji, there is one question in chat. Would you have time, Prabhuji?
I think I'll need to leave now, Mataji, because it's already 6:45 IST.
Thank you so much, Prabhuji, for your time.
Maybe you can connect them with me on WhatsApp. Shama Gauri Mataji, she has my contacts. If someone has a question on a personal note, I'll be happy to connect and speak to them.
Sure, Prabhuji. Yeah. Thank you, Prabhuji.
So much. Hare Krishna. Thank you once again, all the devotees, for having me over and giving me this chance to share some of what I have learned in my own practice of bhakti. Jai Vancha Kalpatrubhyascha Kripa Ananta Koti Vaishnava Vrinda
Ki Jai. Srimad Bhagavatam Ki Jai.
Thank you, Prabhuji.
Thank you so much, Prabhuji. My goodness, that was such a beautiful class.
Thank you, Prabhuji.